Have you ever found yourself nodding along in agreement when deep down you knew something wasn't right? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up, telling yourself it was just being humble? If you've ever wondered whether your quiet compliance is actually spiritual maturity or something else entirely, you're not alone. The uncomfortable truth is that many of us have learned to disguise our spiritual fear as godly submission, and it's robbing us of the authentic relationship with God that our hearts desperately crave. A.W. Tozer, that fearless voice of spiritual authenticity, understood this struggle better than most. He spent his life calling people out of comfortable Christianity and into the sometimes uncomfortable reality of genuine faith. Tozer knew that real submission to God often requires the very courage that false submission tries to avoid. He saw how easily we can mistake our spiritual timidity for humility, our fear of conflict for peacemaking, and our unwillingness to take stands for godly submission. Here's what we're going to discover together in the next few minutes. We're going to look at 3 clear signs that reveal when our submission has crossed the line from genuine humility into spiritual cowardice. More importantly, we're going to learn how to recognize the difference and find the courage to live the authentic spiritual life that God is calling us toward. This isn't about becoming argumentative or prideful, but about discovering what it truly means to submit to God rather than to our own fears. The problem runs deeper than most of us realize. We live in a time when avoiding conflict has become almost a virtue, when keeping the peace is valued above keeping the truth, and when being agreeable is often mistaken for being spiritual. But Tozer would remind us that Jesus himself was anything but a people-pleaser. He spoke truth that made people uncomfortable, challenged religious systems that had grown corrupt, and refused to water down his message just to avoid conflict. Yet somewhere along the way, many of us have learned to equate spiritual maturity with never rocking the boat, never questioning authority, and never standing up for what we believe. We've been taught that good Christians just go along to get along, that submission means never having a strong opinion, and that humility requires us to always defer to others, even when we sense something is wrong. This kind of thinking has created a generation of believers who are afraid to engage with their faith authentically. They've learned to hide behind a false version of submission that actually keeps them from the very relationship with God they're seeking. Instead of growing in spiritual strength and confidence, they remain spiritual children, dependent on others to do their spiritual thinking for them. But here's the truth that Tozer understood so clearly. Real submission to God often requires us to be unsubmissive to human expectations, religious traditions, and social pressures. True humility before God sometimes means having the courage to stand up to people. Authentic spiritual maturity includes the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to submit and when to resist. The journey from spiritual cowardice to authentic faith isn't easy, but it's necessary. It requires us to examine our motives honestly, to face our fears courageously, and to trust that God's approval is worth more than human acceptance. It means learning to distinguish between the voice of God calling us to genuine submission and the voice of fear trying to keep us quiet and compliant. Understanding this difference isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's about discovering who we really are as followers of Christ and learning to live with the kind of spiritual backbone that authentic faith requires. It's about moving from a faith that's driven by fear to a faith that's driven by love, from a spirituality that's focused on avoiding conflict to one that's focused on pleasing God. So let's dive into these 3 signs together. Let's discover how to recognize when our submission has become spiritual cowardice, and more importantly, let's learn how to find the courage to live the authentic spiritual life that God is calling us toward. The first sign that your submission might actually be spiritual cowardice is when you consistently avoid taking responsibility for your own spiritual growth and decisions. This shows up in ways that might surprise you, and it's far more common than most people realize. Think about the last time you were in a situation where you had to make a spiritual decision. Maybe it was choosing whether to speak up about something that didn't align with your values, or deciding how to respond to a situation that challenged your faith. Did you immediately look to others to tell you what to do? Did you defer to authority figures not because you genuinely believed they had wisdom, but because you were afraid of making the wrong choice yourself? True spiritual submission to God actually requires us to take responsibility for our own relationship with Him. It means we can't hide behind other people's decisions or use their authority as an excuse for our own spiritual laziness. When we constantly defer to others not out of respect but out of fear, we're actually avoiding the very work of spiritual growth that God is calling us to do. Tozer understood this deeply. He saw how religious systems could become substitutes for personal relationship with God, how people could become so dependent on others for their spiritual direction that they never learned to hear God's voice for themselves. He knew that authentic faith required personal responsibility, even when it was uncomfortable or scary. Here's what this looks like in real life. You might find yourself always asking others what they think instead of wrestling with issues yourself. You might defer to pastors, friends, or family members, not because you genuinely respect their wisdom, but because you're afraid of getting it wrong. You might avoid reading challenging books, exploring difficult questions, or engaging with ideas that might require you to think differently about your faith. The problem isn't seeking wisdom from others. Scripture actually encourages us to seek counsel and learn from those who are wise. The problem is when we use other people's authority as a way to avoid our own spiritual responsibility, when we hide behind their decisions so we don't have to make our own, when we use their leadership as an excuse for our own spiritual passivity. This kind of false submission actually keeps us spiritually immature. Instead of growing in our ability to discern God's voice and direction, we remain dependent on others to do our spiritual thinking for us. We never develop the spiritual muscles that come from wrestling with difficult questions, making hard decisions, and learning to trust God's guidance in our own lives. Real submission to God includes taking responsibility for our own spiritual journey. It means being willing to seek God's direction personally, even when it's difficult or uncertain. It means being willing to make decisions based on our own understanding of God's will, even when others might disagree. It means owning our choices and their consequences rather than always deferring to others. The second sign that your submission might actually be spiritual cowardice is when you consistently choose peace over truth, especially when staying silent allows harmful situations to continue. This is perhaps the most difficult sign to recognize because it often feels so spiritually mature on the surface. Picture this scenario. You're in a meeting at church, work, or even with family, and someone says something that you know isn't right. Maybe it's factually incorrect, maybe it's hurtful to someone, or maybe it just doesn't align with what you believe God would want. Your first instinct might be to speak up, but then you think about the potential conflict, the awkwardness it might create, the possibility that others might not appreciate your input. So you stay quiet, telling yourself that you're being humble, that you're keeping the peace, that it's not your place to say anything. But here's the uncomfortable question. Are you really being humble, or are you being scared? Are you truly keeping the peace, or are you just avoiding conflict? Sometimes what we call spiritual submission is actually just spiritual cowardice dressed up in religious language. Tozer knew this tendency well. He saw how believers could use humility as a cover for their unwillingness to engage with difficult situations. He understood that real spiritual maturity sometimes requires us to speak uncomfortable truths, to ask difficult questions, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's not popular or easy. Think about Jesus' example. He consistently spoke truth even when it created conflict. He challenged religious leaders when they were wrong, corrected his disciples when they missed the point, and refused to stay quiet when silence would have been more comfortable. He understood that love sometimes requires us to speak difficult truths, and that real peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth and justice. This doesn't mean we should become argumentative or confrontational. It doesn't mean we should look for fights or create unnecessary drama. But it does mean we need to examine our motives honestly when we choose to stay silent. Are we staying quiet because we genuinely believe silence is the wisest choice? Or are we staying quiet because we're afraid of the consequences of speaking up? The difference matters more than we might realize. When we consistently choose silence out of fear rather than wisdom, we enable harmful situations to continue. We allow wrong information to go uncorrected, hurtful behavior to go unchallenged, and injustice to go unaddressed. Our false submission actually becomes a form of complicity in the very things we claim to oppose. Real spiritual courage means being willing to speak truth in love, even when it's difficult. It means being willing to ask hard questions, to challenge assumptions, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. It means understanding that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to speak an uncomfortable truth rather than maintain a comfortable silence. This requires wisdom, of course. We need to learn to discern when to speak and when to remain silent, how to speak truth in ways that are loving and constructive rather than harsh and destructive. But the key is that our decisions should be based on wisdom and love, not on fear and the desire to avoid conflict. The third sign that your submission might actually be spiritual cowardice is when you consistently avoid situations where you might have to stand alone or take an unpopular position. This is perhaps the most subtle form of spiritual cowardice, because it often masquerades as wisdom or prudence. Here's how this plays out in real life. You find yourself always going along with the crowd, always choosing the path of least resistance, always finding ways to avoid situations where you might have to take a stand that others wouldn't support. You might tell yourself that you're being wise, that you're picking your battles, that you're being strategic about when to engage and when to step back. But if you're honest with yourself, you might recognize that you're actually just afraid of standing alone. You're afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being criticized, afraid of being rejected or excluded. So you consistently choose the safety of blending in over the risk of standing out, even when standing out would be the right thing to do. Tozer understood this struggle because he lived it. He often found himself in positions where his commitment to truth put him at odds with popular opinion, even within Christian circles. He had to learn the difference between being contrarian for its own sake and being willing to stand alone when truth demanded it. He discovered that authentic faith sometimes requires us to be willing to be unpopular, to be misunderstood, to be criticized by people whose approval we value. Think about the heroes of faith throughout history. They weren't people who always went along with the crowd. They were people who were willing to stand alone when necessary, who were willing to be unpopular when truth demanded it, who were willing to risk rejection and criticism for the sake of their convictions. This doesn't mean we should be contrarian just for the sake of being different. It doesn't mean we should look for opportunities to be controversial or to stir up trouble. But it does mean we need to be willing to stand alone when our convictions require it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us relationships or opportunities. The problem with always avoiding situations where we might have to stand alone is that it keeps us spiritually weak. We never develop the spiritual courage that comes from having to rely on God when human support isn't available. We never learn to trust God's approval when human approval is withdrawn. We never discover the strength that comes from standing firm in our convictions when the winds of popular opinion are blowing in the opposite direction. Real spiritual maturity includes the willingness to stand alone when necessary. It includes the courage to take unpopular positions when truth demands it. It includes the strength to risk human disapproval for the sake of divine approval. This isn't about being stubborn or prideful, but about having the spiritual backbone that authentic faith requires. The journey from spiritual cowardice to authentic courage isn't something that happens overnight. It requires practice, patience, and a lot of grace for ourselves as we learn to navigate the difference between true humility and false submission. But it's a journey worth taking because it leads us toward the kind of authentic relationship with God that our hearts are truly seeking. So how do we begin to make this change? How do we move from hiding behind false submission to living with authentic spiritual courage? The process begins with honest self-examination and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths about our own motivations and fears. First, we need to start paying attention to our internal responses when we're faced with situations that might require us to speak up or take a stand. Notice when you feel that familiar impulse to defer to others or to stay quiet. Ask yourself, am I choosing this response out of genuine wisdom and humility, or am I choosing it out of fear? Am I truly being led by God's Spirit, or am I being driven by my own desire to avoid conflict and maintain approval? This kind of honest self-examination isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. We can't change patterns we don't recognize, and we can't address problems we're not willing to acknowledge. The goal isn't to become self-critical or to beat ourselves up for past choices, but to develop the kind of spiritual self-awareness that allows us to make better choices going forward. Second, we need to start deliberately putting ourselves in situations where we might have to exercise spiritual courage. This doesn't mean looking for fights or creating unnecessary drama, but it does mean being willing to engage with challenging situations rather than always finding ways to avoid them. It means being willing to ask hard questions, to express unpopular opinions when they're based on truth and love, and to take stands that might not be popular but are right. This is where the rubber meets the road in spiritual growth. We can't develop courage by always choosing the safe path. We can't grow in spiritual strength by always avoiding situations that might require us to be strong. Just like physical muscles grow through resistance and challenge, spiritual muscles grow through being exercised in difficult situations. Third, we need to remember that our ultimate submission is to God, not to human expectations or social pressures. This means we need to spend time in prayer and study, learning to recognize God's voice and direction for our lives. We need to develop the kind of intimate relationship with God that allows us to distinguish between His leading and our own fears or the pressure of others' expectations. This relationship with God becomes our source of strength and courage. When we know that we're ultimately accountable to Him rather than to human approval, it becomes easier to make choices based on truth and love rather than fear and convenience. When we understand that His approval is what matters most, we can find the courage to risk human disapproval when it's necessary. The practical steps for developing this kind of authentic submission are actually quite simple, though they're not always easy to implement. Start by spending time each day in quiet reflection and prayer, asking God to show you areas where fear might be masquerading as humility in your life. Be willing to sit with uncomfortable truths about yourself and your motivations without immediately trying to justify or explain them away. Begin to practice speaking up in small, low-stakes situations where you might normally stay quiet. If someone asks for your opinion, give it honestly rather than just deferring to others. If you notice misinformation being shared, politely correct it rather than staying silent. If you see someone being treated unfairly, speak up rather than hoping someone else will handle it. As you practice these small acts of courage, you'll begin to develop the spiritual strength needed for bigger challenges. You'll start to recognize the difference between wisdom and fear, between genuine humility and false submission. You'll begin to experience the freedom that comes from living authentically rather than hiding behind comfortable compliance. Remember that this journey isn't about becoming argumentative or confrontational. It's about becoming authentic. It's about learning to live from a place of truth and love rather than fear and avoidance. It's about discovering the kind of spiritual courage that allows us to be fully ourselves while still maintaining loving relationships with others. The beauty of this transformation is that it actually makes us more effective in our relationships and our service to God, not less. When we're not constantly worried about maintaining approval or avoiding conflict, we can engage more freely and authentically with others. When we're not hiding behind false submission, we can offer our genuine gifts and insights to the world around us. This doesn't mean we'll always get it right. There will be times when we speak up when we should have stayed quiet, and times when we stay quiet when we should have spoken up. There will be times when we mistake our own stubbornness for spiritual courage, and times when we mistake genuine wisdom for cowardice. But the key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep moving toward greater authenticity in our relationship with God and others. The goal isn't perfection, but progress. It's not about never making mistakes, but about learning from them and continuing to grow. It's about becoming the kind of people who can be trusted with truth, who can be relied upon to speak up when it matters, and who can stand firm in their convictions while still maintaining love and respect for others. As we wrap up our time together, let's remember that the journey from spiritual cowardice to authentic courage is really a journey toward the kind of relationship with God that our hearts are truly seeking. It's about discovering what it means to submit to God rather than to our own fears, to live with spiritual backbone rather than spiritual timidity, and to engage with our faith authentically rather than just going through the motions. The three signs we've discussed today, avoiding spiritual responsibility, choosing peace over truth, and always avoiding situations where we might have to stand alone, are really invitations to examine our own hearts and motivations. They're opportunities to ask ourselves whether we're living from a place of authentic faith or from a place of fear and avoidance. But here's the encouragement I want to leave you with. God isn't calling you to become someone you're not. He's calling you to become who you really are beneath all the layers of fear and false submission. He's calling you to discover the spiritual courage that He's already placed within you, to live with the authenticity that brings freedom, and to engage with your faith in a way that's both deeply personal and genuinely courageous. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But it does happen, and when it does, it brings a sense of spiritual freedom and authenticity that makes all the discomfort of the journey worthwhile. You discover that you can trust God's love even when human approval is withdrawn. You learn that you can stand firm in your convictions while still maintaining loving relationships. You find that authentic submission to God actually gives you the courage to be unsubmissive to human expectations when necessary. So I want to encourage you to take that first step, whatever it might be for you. Maybe it's speaking up in a situation where you would normally stay quiet. Maybe it's taking responsibility for a decision instead of deferring to others. Maybe it's standing alone in a conviction that you know is right, even when others might not understand or agree. Whatever that first step is, take it with confidence that God is with you, that He's calling you toward greater authenticity, and that He'll give you the grace and strength you need for the journey. The spiritual courage you're seeking isn't something you have to manufacture on your own. It's something that grows naturally as you learn to trust God more and fear human disapproval less. Remember, authentic submission to God often requires the very courage that false submission tries to avoid. Real humility before God sometimes means having the courage to stand up to people. True spiritual maturity includes the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to submit and when to resist. The journey toward authentic faith is worth taking, not just because it makes us better people, but because it brings us into the kind of relationship with God that our hearts are truly seeking. It's a journey from fear to love, from avoidance to engagement, from false submission to authentic courage. And it's a journey that God is inviting you to take, one step at a time, with His grace and strength supporting you every step of the way.